Good afternoon. My name is Merritt Jano. I'm a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs in the Law School and an affiliated faculty with the Weatherhead East Asia Institute. It's my great pleasure to moderate this afternoon's panel. Let me ask you, I am too curious, how many of you are Columbia alums? Could you show me by raised hands? Marvelous. Thank you so much for coming. You know from your years at Columbia that we work hard at Columbia, and I'm afraid we're going to continue that trend today. This afternoon's discussion is focused on the financial crisis. The U.S. has, of course, been in the eye of the storm. Indeed, we have triggered the storm. And the causes of the crisis, the macro-prudential, regulatory, and other reforms that are needed in the United States in the wake of this crisis are hotly debated topics, particularly at Columbia. And as you would expect, we have many experts whose voices are being heard in the current policy debates. By now, the federal level action is increasingly clear, and through a variety of measures, some of which I frankly did not know were even available instruments to the U.S. government, there have been a host of steps taken on the liquidity front and on the regulatory front. And however one feels about the approaches that have been taken, this is unquestionably the most dramatic period of regulatory reform of our financial oversight system, I think, since the 1930s. And internationally, while it may be easy to be a bit cynical about global meetings, be it G8 or the new G20, my own feeling is that in the last two sets of G20 meetings, the response has been very serious to the crisis. And through concerted, although not identical, actions on fiscal, monetary, regulatory, and financial support measures, through substantial additional support to the IMF, lending to developing countries potentially, and support for trade financing, as well as an accelerated timetable for broader institutional reforms or consideration of such reforms. There have been a number of important steps and enhanced cooperation on regulatory issues. I do not see in the United States any particular appetite for the establishment of a global financial regulator, but certainly more coordination and cooperation is now underway. And I think perhaps some interesting and important convergence in thinking between the United States and Europe, such that there may be a reduced likelihood of financial regulatory arbitrage, which one used to see more frequently, and particularly with respect to instruments such as credit default swaps and other instruments that have been part of the problem. In the United States, there is hardly a day that goes by when there isn't a major article in the media about China's rise and what it means for China, for the United States, and for the world. I've been a student in some ways of U.S.-China relations since the mid-1970s, and some of the current academic and policy debates do have some familiar and recurring themes. I'm sure you've seen in the debate in the Foreign Affairs recently, in the articles about how best the United States and the Obama administration should work with China, discussion about do we need some kind of new G20, mention was made by the Vice Minister of that a few minutes ago, or are plurilateral approaches the right way forward, or multilateral. These discussions about how best to work in a deep and thoughtful way with China are enduring, evolving questions. But now we have new and important dimensions as well that come with our deepened sense of financial and economic linkage with China and China's important role as a source of financing and credit for the United States. Now, one of the many lessons from this financial crisis is that there is no real economic decoupling. And of course, China's growth rate and trade picture have been seriously impacted by the crisis. The global trade picture, which is not the primary focus of this panel, but I think will be touched upon, has also been seriously impacted. It is an area of my expertise, and I noticed that although the impact in China has been serious, it's been even more serious with Japan, which has witnessed a 46% drop in trade in February as compared with a year ago. I think comparable figures for China are about 26%, and for the US about 22%. And there are concerns about some signs of global protectionism raising its head in many subtle ways around the world, especially through subsidy arrangements, regulatory and procurement practices, and other less transparent means than the old-fashioned mechanisms. This is evident in both developed and developing worlds. It's a subject that China government has expressed concern about. I think in the face of this financial crisis, there is a general perception that Japanese financial institutions are quite vulnerable, but Chinese financial institutions have been somewhat insulated from the crisis, generally well capitalized, and the economy on a relative basis is doing better than some of its neighbors. China's own fiscal stimulus measures are getting a lot of attention, and many have observed that Chinese measures appear to have some features that are positive in the sense that they are not the classic bridges and roads to nowhere, which has come with some nations' stimulus, but recognize and are targeted to China's development needs. I'm sure our panel will have some views on this. I notice there's also discussion about the extent to which consumption can be triggered in China and the extent to which the stimulus loans are being diverted into asset markets instead of the real economy. Perhaps our panel will touch on this. In today's world, China is without question playing more of a global role and expressing its voice in new ways. Now, I served for 4 years as the North American judge on the WTO appellate body, and I saw China as an active and engaged participant at the World Trade Organization and in the dispute settlement system. But we're also seeing recently more public diplomacy by senior Chinese officials, and this is, I think, a very important development. Of course, the comments by the Premier in April that he was concerned about the safety of our assets, referring to China's huge stock of treasury bills. Later, the remarks of the head of China's central bank suggesting the need for another global reserve currency. And in April, an article by the Minister of Commerce saying that American complaints about China's trade policy would seriously test China-US economic and trade relations. All of these types of expressions from China are somewhat new to American audiences and have generated a lot of attention and interest. Perhaps the financial crisis is accelerating, it appears, this trend for public engagement. I think we have with us an extraordinary panel of experts to help think about this financial crisis and offer some perspectives. I have a very difficult job because each can only speak for 10 minutes, while all of them need the entire period that we have. So I will have to cut them off after 10 minutes and give them an additional 2 minutes after that. And I would like to invite them to speak in the order in which they are seated. Professor Pettis, Dr. Wang, Professor Ban, and Mr. Chairman Lee. You have their biographies, so I will be very brief in what I say now. But let me just highlight a couple of features of each of our distinguished speakers. Professor Pettis is a specialist in Chinese financial markets at Beijing and has previously taught at Tsinghua, and he's also had a long and distinguished career in Wall Street, having worked at manufacturers Hanover, Bear Stearns, Credit Suisse. He's affiliated and is a member of the Institute of Latin American Studies Advisory Board at Columbia, as well as the Dean's Advisory Board. He's a double Columbian, I think we can claim him for that, having both an MBA in Finance and MIA in Economics, and we thank you for joining us. Dr. Wang is the head of economic research at UBS Securities. She's a PhD economist from a school down the street from us in New York, and she had a very distinguished career at the IMF, and she is a widely respected economist who will offer some unique perspectives today on China. Professor Bein is a leading finance professor at Columbia Business School. He spent 25 years in investment banking in very senior positions at First Boston, at Bankers Trust, at Dillon Reed. He has co-authored a major treatise on finance and written many articles and books, and is the director of some important mutual funds in the United States, and will share his perspective with us. And Charles Lee is also a Columbian of great distinction. He is a graduate from our law school. He is currently chairman of JP Morgan Chase China and is responsible for all of JP Morgan Chase's business. He has nearly 20 years of experience in the financial services sector. His bio also shares with us that he had an early life as an offshore oil driller in North China and as a journalist, so he has seen a tremendous amount of the world. And I'm reading in the newspapers that he is soon to become the CEO of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So we're very grateful that you've taken time to join us. So without further delay, thank you for your attention, and could I invite Professor Pettis to start us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak here. As you may have guessed from the comments, I'm a very hardcore Columbia guy. I spent many years there. I've recruited there. I've done lots of stuff there. So I'm very honored to be asked to speak here. In the little over 7 years that I've been in China, it was always pretty easy for me to introduce myself in any of these presentations, because it was pretty straightforward that I was always the pessimist. For a long time, they needed an optimist and a pessimist, and there was only one big pessimist out there, and it was always me. In the last year, it's been a little bit more difficult, a little bit more harder to position myself, because I think there's an increasing sense among a number of people that we're going through a major shift, and it's not going to be a very pretty one. I want to talk a little bit about what I see as the global crisis and what the impact is on Asia generally, but on China more specifically. And the first thing that I would say is that, in one sense, the crisis that we've gone through in the last 2 to 3 years is very different from anything we've experienced in the last 20 to 30 years. But having said that, it's not that different. In other words, we've seen this many times before. As I counted, there are, in the last 200 years, there have been something like 5 to 6 of these globalization cycles, and they all share certain features. One of the features that they share is that within the cycle, there can be from time to time crises, and they get resolved pretty quickly. Another feature that they share is that they do come to an end, and I would argue that we are now at the end of the latest of these globalization cycles, which is generally a liquidity cycle, and that has a number of implications for the world and for China. I wanted to title this presentation the Death of the Asian Development Model. And I think this is what we're going to see. I think 2008, in retrospect, will be seen as the time in which the Asian development model, which has been a very successful development model for the last 20 to 30 years, will have come to an end. And this is particularly relevant for China, because I would argue that China is, in a sense, the Asian development model on steroids. It's the most extreme case of that. What do I mean by the Asian development model? There are lots of different ways of discussing it, and obviously there are differences from country to country, but basically the model involved a number of things. It involved policies that were very specifically aimed at boosting savings and generating huge investment in production facilities. So one of the consequences of this Asian development model is that because increasing savings is the same thing as constraining consumption, One of the consequences of this model has been that production has systematically outpaced, or the growth in production has systematically outpaced the growth in consumption. Now, you'll remember from your econ classes that means that countries in which production exceeds consumption run trade surpluses. And the Asian development model has required a systematic growth in trade surpluses, and we see that most extremely in the case of China, where you've had trade surpluses for much of the last 20 to 30 years, but particularly in the last 10 years, we've seen an explosion in the trade surplus. Why does that matter? It matters because the global balance of payments must balance. And if we're going to have production exceeding consumption in one part of the world, we must have consumption exceed production in another part of the world. That's just a complicated way of saying, if we're going to see trade surpluses in one part of the world, we must see trade deficits in another part of the world. Going through all of the numbers, that's also another way of saying, if we're going to see very high savings in one part of the world, we must see very low savings in another part of the world. It all has to balance out. It's useful sometimes to think of the world basically as consisting of two countries, the United States and China, because most of this has taken place in these two countries. Now, if we think about what's happened in China over the last 20 years, and especially over the last 10 years, we've seen high and rising trade surpluses. There's a huge debate as to what has caused this high savings, whose fault it is, which is a pretty fruitless debate, but we spend a lot of time arguing about that, whether there was excess savings on the part of Asians or excess consumption on the part of the United States. Like I said, I think it's a fruitless debate, but I think it is important to know that you can't have one without the other. So one thing that we know about the Asian development model and the tendency to run large trade surpluses is that somebody must run large trade deficits. And to a certain extent, that somebody could only be the United States. It's the only economy large enough, it's the only economy flexible enough, and it's the only economy with a financial system flexible enough that it could systematically run these large trade deficits. The fact that Americans are very eager to consume didn't hurt. So for the last 20 years, and especially the last 10 years, you've had this relationship where the Chinese financial system and the US financial system basically made the same bet, and it was a mistaken bet. And the bet was that US consumers had an infinite capacity for leverage. They could continue borrowing and consuming forever. US consumption could continue growing faster than US production forever. What was the bet? American banks made it directly in the form of consumer loans, but Chinese banks also made the same bet. They made it in the form of producer loans. Now, we know that the argument that American consumers can consume forever, can leverage forever, was false. And we're seeing the consequences of that now. And both of those bets are going to go bad in very spectacular ways, I think. I would argue, and I don't think this is a very controversial statement, that over the last 10 to 15 years, US debt levels have risen to levels that were unsustainable, and we are now in a process of deleveraging. So US households are going to be paying down debt or defaulting on debt, but one way or the other we're going to see debt coming down. And I think this is a process that won't end in 1 or 2 years. I think this is a fairly long-term process. So what does that mean? If debt levels come down, we can think of consumption, growth in consumption, is equal to the growth in GDP plus or minus the change in debt, which is just a very complicated way of saying, as debt levels come down, US consumption growth is going to underperform US GDP growth. And one of the consequences is we're going to see the US trade deficit come down. Now, this is not really exceptional or surprising. At the end of all of these globalization periods, we see what looks like a collapse in international trade. International trade comes down significantly, as does international capital flows, which are necessary for that trade. So I would argue that over the next few years, we're going to see the US trade deficit come down substantially. If the US trade deficit comes down substantially, well, let me step back. What does substantially mean? Historically, the US trade deficit has run under 1% of GDP. As we know, about 2 years ago, it went up to above 6% of GDP. I believe, depending on which period you're looking at it now, it's perhaps around 3% of GDP. It still has a long ways to go. After the big explosion in the trade deficit in the 1980s, when the US trade deficit went up to 3.5% of GDP, we actually saw the trade deficit come down and turn into a small surplus in the early 1990s. Will that happen again? I don't know, but it's not unreasonable to assume that it might happen again. If the US runs a very low trade deficit, if the US runs even a trade surplus, that means the rest of the world running trade deficits must also bring those trade deficits down. How do they do that? It's going to be a very, very slow and very difficult process to do that. Basically, the way I think about the world is the US consumes more than it produces, and we're now seeing that those two numbers come back into line. China produces more than it consumes. We're going to have to see those two numbers come back into line. How do they come back into line? There's two ways that can happen. The golden way is you raise consumption up to meet production levels. So in that case, as US consumption declines, or rather US net consumption, the amount of consumption the US provides to the rest of the world, Chinese net production must come down. And it comes down because either consumption goes up or production goes down. The golden way is for consumption to go up. The bad way is for production to come down. This is what happened to the United States in the 1930s. The United States was the great trade surplus country of the 1920s. And in the crisis in 1929, 1930, 1931, international trade collapsed. And the US was forced to adjust its overproduction domestically. Unfortunately, the way it did it, and the way it usually happens, is that production comes down to meet consumption, and as it does so, consumption is also declining. Why? Because how does production come down? It comes down by closing down factories and firing workers, and as you fire workers, they consume less. Will that happen in China? There is a lot of talk about raising consumption levels in China to make up for the decline of consumption in the US, net consumption. But I'm very, very skeptical that that's going to happen. And I'm very skeptical for three reasons. Reason number one is that China is not the first country in history that has made or is trying to make the shift from an export-led growth to a domestic market-led growth. Other countries have done that. At the beginning of the 19th century, the United States also had to go through that transition. One could argue that after the 1990 crisis, Japan has also been going through that transition. Brazil had to go through the transition in the 1970s. It's very difficult. It's typically taken 10 to 20 very difficult years to make that transition. So the historical precedents are not so good. The historical precedents suggest that it could take a decade or longer for China to successfully make that transition, where consumption levels are high enough to absorb all of that production. But there are other reasons for being pessimistic. The second reason, I would argue, is that for many years, 2 minutes, for many years, there's been I just came off a plane, so I'm a little scattered here. My timing is way off. But there's been an acknowledgement among Chinese policymakers that China needed to make that shift. It's been widely accepted by everyone that China is overly dependent on exports and needs to shift towards a domestic consumption model. But what's happened? In the last 5 years, consumption as a share of GDP has actually declined, exports have risen, and the trade surplus has exploded. In other words, we've gone exactly backwards, even though policymakers have all agreed that we need to move in the right direction. The third reason why I'm very pessimistic is if you look at the policies that are put into place, the so-called fiscal stimulus package, none of it is really addressing the consumption problem. China is increasing consumption, but it's not increasing net consumption. How is it increasing consumption? By increasing production. For example, in the month of April, aluminum production expanded dramatically, even though the world doesn't want aluminum. Why did it do so? Because factories in Hunan were closing down. They pumped money into the factories, boosted them up. That keeps them from firing workers, but it doesn't add to net consumption. It actually reduces net consumption, and the proof is the trade surplus, which is higher this year than it was last year. I know I'm way over time, but the last thing I want to mention is that most of the expansion has taken place through an expansion in the banking system. We are almost certain that we're going to see a significant increase in non-performing loans. And I would argue that the process of resolving the increase in non-performing loans, which is something we're going to have to start working on in a couple of years, itself constrains consumption. Because the two ways they do that is by taking savings via the government and passing it on to the banks, or keeping interest rates really low to guarantee profitability for the banking system. And in China, low interest rates tend to hurt the growth of consumption. So my very pessimistic look on this is that we all know China must make that transition. But I would argue that the historical evidence is that it's a very slow and difficult process. And more importantly, what we've seen in the last 3, 4, 5 years is that the process is actually going backwards. It is very, very difficult to make that transition. So I would argue that we're going to see ahead of us quite a difficult decade as China struggles to adjust to a world of declining US consumption and or rising US savings, which is the same thing. I apologize for going over, but we should have.